I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler. This is our second week, our second podcast in a row, and I am every bit as excited as I was last week to bring you the latest and the greatest in the battle for the betterment of your own brain. If you stick around until the very end of this podcast episode, I'm going to tell you something which it's not exactly new news, but it's news to me. I hadn't heard it. It's about 2 months old. Anyway, it's probably news to you too. It involves the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the nation of India, and why it may soon be easier and or cheaper for you to get your hands on Provigil, also known as its generic equivalent, modafinil. If you haven't heard of either of those two substances, then honestly, I'm a little surprised you're at this podcast at all, because modafinil is probably one of the most well-known mental enhancement drugs that are floating around out there nowadays. It's the thing that kids are using to stay awake for 3 days straight while they study for their midterm exams in college and stuff like that. Fighter pilots are using it so they can fly airplanes for 24 hours at a stretch while they're doing whatever they do, flying airplanes for 24 hours at a stretch. I don't know, that's top secret stuff. Anyway, if you stick around until the end of this episode, we will tell you that. The main heart of what we got going on here today is an interview with Dr. Carol Greenwood. Carol is Canada's leading professor on nutrition and brain health. Apparently somebody in the great nation of Canada decided to get all their nutrition and brain health professors together, have them duke it out, and Carol came out on top. So congratulations, Carol, and we've got her on the podcast. Carol is talking about her favorite two subjects and also her new ebook, which has just been released, called Mindful. Mindful is a recipe book chock full of recipes that have all been sort of calibrated or built around ingredients that are beneficial to brain health. So not only do you get to eat food that looks incredibly good based on the photographs, but also everything's going to benefit not just your taste buds, but also your neurochemistry. So 3 cheers for that. But before we get to that interview, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
All right, This Week in Neuroscience, a little bit of controversy. According to no less authority than Professor Barbara Sahakian of Cambridge University in Great Britain, as many as 10% of UK students and 16% of American college students are now using performance-enhancing drugs to improve their academic results. Bum, bum, bum. That's the scary music playing. I don't know if we'll actually drop any scary music there or not, but anyway, so the concern is that this gives them an unfair advantage over their non-performance enhanced classmates, and that they might actually start doing random drug testing, similar to what they do with like Olympic athletes and stuff like that, against students that are trying to, get an unfair edge that way. I mean, if I can editorialize a little on this, I assume that the reason they would consider this cheating is that they're thinking that it's going to be unrepresentative of their performance in the workplace, and so it's like they're getting better grades than they really should be getting. But if these same people that are taking these performance-enhancing drugs in college are going to presumably be taking them when they come across a similarly mentally challenging situation in the workplace, then I don't see what sort of misrepresentation is going on and why there's any sort of ethical issue at all. I would be curious to hear people's thoughts on this. I assume anybody listening to this podcast is probably going to agree with me, so I don't know. If you disagree with me, let me know. Email jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. Would love to hear from you.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm talking with Dr. Carol Greenwood, senior scientist with Baycrest Health Sciences in Toronto. Baycrest is a global leader in innovations in aging and brain research, and Dr. Greenwood is also Canada's leading professor of nutrition and brain health at the University of Toronto. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
So tell me a little about the book that you've got coming out, Mindful, or the ebook.
Yes, it's a book that we pulled together that really tried to tie together the science that we understand in terms of the relationship between diet, nutrition, and brain health with then professional recipe developers trying to help people take that science and translate it into what would that look like when they sat down at their dining room table.
So there's such a thing out there as a professional recipe developer.
Yes, and it's kind of, these are people that not only, sort of write cookbooks, but they would also work with a lot of companies companies that, let's say, are coming out with novel ingredients, or, we often see recipes that you would pick up in your grocery store and stuff like that. And these would be people that they do that professionally, but they're also linked in so that there's a whole group around that, not only in terms of developing the recipe, but then people testing it to make sure that, the recipe itself would work in somebody else's kitchen. And you have another set of people that will do the nutritional analysis. So there's this whole cluster of folks that professionally look at developing and launching recipes.
There's a whole lot of science going on, the science of the brain research and the science of developing the recipe and making sure people can cook it.
Absolutely. And so I know the science of kind of the brain, and personally I enjoy cooking, but I wouldn't have had the expertise in terms of doing that next piece.
Yeah, gotcha. No, I've looked through the book extensively, and there's a lot of different recipes in here. And yeah, I was assuming it probably wasn't all like your grandma's recipes or something like that, because there's just too darn many of them, and the chances of grandma getting everything right with the brain chemistry is probably pretty small.
Absolutely right. So Daphne Rabinovitz, one of the co-authors, is the person that brought that expertise, and she, for many years, had written for a magazine in Canada called Canadian Living, but like a lot of magazines like Cosmopolitan and all of those types of things, they often have recipes in there, and that's one of the functions that these professional recipe developers would serve.
Fantastic. One question that I had, sort of looking through the book, everything looked extremely healthy and sort of was in agreement with a lot of what you hear about just sort of for basic whole body nutrition. Did you find, are there any differences between optimizing your diet for your brain versus optimizing your diet for the rest of the body? Are there ever any times when one might be in opposition to the other, or is it kind of a,
It's a great question, and thankfully the answer to that is no. We know one of the main things that we really need to do is focus on heart health and the health of our blood vessels, because if you can't get a good blood supply into the brain, then you're going to start running into brain-related problems. So all of the heart health, kind of stroke-related information that's coming out, it's going to be exactly the same that you're wanting to do for your brain. The other piece that we're particularly interested in is the connection between diabetes and loss of cognitive function with aging. So clearly, the same guidelines that would be associated with prevention of diabetes are going to be the ones that are good for the brain as well. Probably the only place where the brain is a little bit unique is that it has higher concentrations of those omega-3 fatty acids that we hear about, and particularly the form of the omega-3 fatty acids that we find in fish. So if you're looking in terms of what would be unique to the brain, when we start to think from a nutritional perspective, it's probably its greater need for the omega-3 fats.
Now, I remember that sort of in your overall diet, you're supposed to try to keep, I believe it's about a 2-to-1 ratio of omega-3 fats to omega-6 fats. Is that the same?
2-to-1, you're quite right. But we know that many people in North America are not achieving that. So that's where there's been a lot of push in terms of trying to encourage people to eat foods that are naturally high in the omega-3s. One is fats like olive oil that are very high in the monounsaturated fatty acid, and that's simply because it's associated with lower cholesterol and better heart health. And because we say we need heart health for brain health, it's going to be, linked into to brain health in that way. But then, things like the flaxes and some of the nuts and other foods where you can try to naturally go after the omega-3 fatty acids is also important.
Okay. And if I remember right, the difference between the type of omega-3s that you get from animal sources like fish versus what you get from vegetarian sources is essentially it's a shorter chain molecule that your body needs to kind of stitch it together a little bit if you're eating the kind that from vegetarian sources rather than...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the molecules that would come naturally in plants are what we say 18 carbons, or you can kind of think of 18 pearls long, and we need to get them up to 20 to 24 carbons long in order for them to have the biologic role for the brain. So our bodies can do some of that, but it's not necessarily as efficient in terms of making sure that we really do meet all of those brain needs, which is why we encourage people to make sure that some of their omega-3s are actually coming from fish or fish oil so that they're getting that natural source of the longer chain omega-3s.
Gotcha. Let's see. One question as far as fish, a lot of people, they hear fish, they think mercury and get a little bit nervous about that. I'm actually of that ilk myself.
Right.
Where do you draw the line? How much is...
how much can you safely eat? Yeah, and it's a concern not only in terms of the mercury, but certainly from the Canadian perspective in terms of whether you're purchasing the wild or the farmed fish. There's certainly sort of the health guidelines in terms of what can be sold as fish within North America are really unreasonably stringent. So to a certain extent, you have to trust that either the FDA or Health Canada in our situation are playing that role quite well. So what's going to predict the mercury content of a fish is basically its size and its lifespan. So the larger and the older the fish, the more likely that they would have accumulated mercury over time. And so regulations on fish such as tuna are such that we're not allowed to put tunas beyond a certain size into human consumption. And that's really a break point in terms of trying to protect against the mercury.
That's kind of the tuna equivalent of getting tenure. It's like once you make it to a certain size, nobody's going to eat you anymore.
Exactly.
So jumping around a little bit, obviously we're gonna put a link to your book on our website, and hopefully everybody will be downloading their own copy. But to give people a tidbit, what do you think right now is sort of the number one mistake that people are making in the standard North American diet as far as what they could be doing or should be doing for their brain health?
There's no question about it. In North America, we are not eating enough fruit and vegetables. And that's probably the number one concern that we have, not only in terms of brain health, but also in terms of heart health and other chronic diseases. So turning to those fruits and vegetables is one of the prime things that we need to do. Now, I think where we try to give a little bit more of a balanced view on that is that we hear a lot of information these days in terms of superfoods as it relates to fruits and vegetables. And I think, truly from the brain health perspective and what we know from human epidemiology studies is that we don't have any indication that any one fruit or vegetable is healthier than another. So it's really trying to encourage people to turn to those fruits and vegetables, not worry excessively in terms of if you're wanting to pick up kale or Swiss chard or broccoli or cauliflower, pick up the one that you like.
Gotcha. So you might as well buy the 10-cent banana rather than the $3.50 acai berry.
That's right, because at this point we don't have, certainly in a lot of these instances there are animal studies which would be suggestive that some of these foods may be a little bit more potent, but do we have data that translates into a human context that tells us the same is happening in humans? The answer to that is no, but we have lots and lots of data to suggest that people that are not consuming enough fruit and vegetables are eating a lot of animal fat, which is going to come with red meat, and eating lots of highly processed foods are the people that are showing cognitive decline. So start globally in terms of making those changes rather than thinking that because you had kale last night for dinner that you don't have to worry about going out and having your French fries and hamburger for lunch today.
I guess I feel like most people, they think, okay, at some point today I ate some fruits and vegetables, that's enough, rather than thinking I should be getting X% of my total caloric intake should be coming from fruits and vegetables. I feel like if people thought about it in that way, they might realize just what a mass quantity of fruits and vegetables really should be in their diet.
Yeah, and I think we've realized in North America that trying to tell people that they should have so many servings of fruits and vegetables is not helping them. I think that the National Institute of Health has come out with a great thing that they call MyPlate, which is really depicting what your plate should look like when you sit down at the dining room table. And that's saying that half of it should be fruit and vegetable.
Yeah, that seems a lot more quantifiable to people, because I think thinking of it as far as a ratio rather than just like I need to work it in there somewhere is a much different way of approaching it.
Yep, and that's why I really like what they're doing with the MyPlate icon, because it's easy, right? You're sitting down, you look at your plate. I jokingly say that half of it should be green, but basically half of it should be highly colorful fruit and vegetable.
And the colors matter, right? It's like you really want to make sure you're getting a variety of those different colored fruits and vegetables, because that all represents different phytochemicals.
Absolutely. And again, I don't think we really have the evidence that suggests that any one phytochemical is better than another. So you're better to eat as broadly as possible across all fruits and vegetables to make sure that you're getting a good exposure to a variety of different phytochemicals.
Now, some people are going to, hear that and say, well, what about the Eskimos? Didn't they, did well as far as heart disease and, neurological decline and things like that, but they were eating, seal blubber. Like, what's the response to that?
Well, I think the response is really to look at it in the context of their overall lifestyle. One of the major problems that we've encountered with the technological revolution is that it's been at a huge cost to activity. When you think to any advancement that we've made over the last 200 years, all of it has actually been related to reducing our activity levels, whether it's elevators so we no longer use stairs or, whatever. So we're fighting against the fact that in many instances that we're dealing with a population that has become very sedentary.
Yeah, yeah. You're talking to somebody that's on a computer for 10 hours every day, so I certainly plead guilty.
Absolutely. It's just, kind of as much as technological advancement is fabulous, right? But there has been a cost to it. And, I joke when I talk about this, say that when I was a child, surfing was something that was very active, and now it's something that's very passive.
Right. Yeah.
So when you look back to those traditional communities and you start to think of the physical activity that they required for survival, that was another way of maintaining heart health and, health of our blood vessels and all of those types of things, because they were doing it against such a high level and high context of physical activity, which is not part of our lifestyle anymore.
That's a great response.
And we also know that if you look at our First Nations populations now that are becoming more sedentary as a lot of these advancements are coming in, that they're having huge health problems.
Yeah, I know that they found that with a lot of South Pacific Islanders, like in the 1950s, when all of a sudden they started having access to Wonder Bread and things like that. Within like a half a generation, their health just plummeted.
Exactly. And certainly when we look at, sort of native populations in Canada, we're seeing exactly the same thing. So, it's kind of how do we help those people get back to their more traditional lifestyle as a way of helping to maintain health.
So what would you say, the number one thing people are doing wrong is not eating enough fruits and vegetables? Probably the number one best change they can make is just to add more. Is there anything else you'd like to say is sort of an easy positive fix, or sort of the across the board more fruits and vegetables?
I think the other is, as a society, we've tended to buy in to the fact that we don't have time to prepare food any longer, and and that really has been a push by food companies and grocery stores and all of those types of things in order to go out and buy, for them what are value add products. And I would argue that it takes no longer to go into the grocery store, pick up a variety of fruits and vegetables when you're there, chop them up and turn them into your own salad. So I think we really got to stand back and question the degree to which we can't give ourselves 15 minutes at the end of the day to attend to our own health.
I totally agree. I think one of the best things that people can buy, if you're moving into an apartment with nothing in it, the first thing you should buy is a blender, because like what can't you make with a blender?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How do you feel as far as many small meals spread out throughout the day versus a few larger meals, as far as your brain health, nutrition, neurology, alertness, stuff like that?
Right. Well, I think just from a body weight regulation perspective, it would argue that, people that eat more smaller meals, actually, it's easier for those people to regulate their body weight rather than people that kind of sit down and gorge, sort of once or twice a day. And the reason I bring that up from a brain health perspective is that we know that a lot of the obesity-associated disorders like high blood pressure and diabetes and elevated cholesterol are themselves dementia risk factors. So having a focus on maintaining your body weight as you age is also extremely important. So even just from a body weight perspective, it's important. But I think also we know that we do need to continue to fuel the brain. And the times of day where you may be most vulnerable to that are going to be a little bit different depending on what age category you're in. But lots of good evidence in terms of, the adverse effect of not eating breakfast. We know that a lot of older adults late afternoon are sort of going into a natural low in terms of their cognitive function. But, maybe having a little bit of carbohydrate before you go into that late afternoon meeting is something that's going to start providing more glucose to the brain and sort of just lift you so that you're feeling cognitively alert during those meetings. So, yeah, I think that looking in terms of trying to spread the food over the day rather than, as I say, somebody who skips lunch or skips breakfast, only has a small lunch and effectively gorges for dinner is the person that's going to end up in problems, not only from obesity, but also from a, just day-to-day cognitive perspective.
Gotcha. Yeah. As far as talking about things we do at different times of day to affect our brain, of course, one of the big ones for most people in the world is coffee. And I'd love to hear your sort of weighing in on caffeine in general. There's.
That's right. As a dedicated caffeine consumer, you're not going to hear anything negative from me. I think, sort of all of the evidence is suggesting that as long as we take caffeine in moderation, that there's no adverse health effects associated with it.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. And yes, you do have a PhD, so sing it from the mountaintops.
That's right. So the real question is, what does moderation mean, right? So both of our countries try to come up with guidelines saying not more than about 350 milligrams a day, which would be 4 to 5 cups of coffee, and probably double that. And if you're drinking your caffeine as tea. But, at the end of the day, I think each of us kind of have to take responsibility to understanding our own body tolerance to caffeine. So what you don't want to do is end up in that downward spiral where you're drinking caffeine too late in the day. As a consequence, it's interfering with your sleep, and you're waking up in the morning groggy and reaching for the caffeine again.
Right.
So you do have that downward spiral. There's the potential. And the level of caffeine that each of us can tolerate before it starts interfering with our sleep is going to be different from one person to another. So to try and establish a set point where it's really an individual response is very difficult. I think most people, you'll notice as they age, probably their metabolism of caffeine slows down a little bit. And so they'll find that, sort of with aging, most people will sort of naturally stop their caffeine consumption earlier and earlier in the day. I used to be somebody that could drink a cup of coffee at 9 o'clock at night and, kind of go to bed at 10 and fall asleep within 5 minutes. I can't do that anymore, and I find that the last time I generally have coffee is about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But that's just me responding to my own body cycles, and I think each of us need to do that.
I wanted to jump over and talk about glucose versus running your brain on ketosis, running your brain operating on fat versus sugars, and how that affects brains.
So I think, sort of I'll start by saying that in the normal person, I think that we probably don't know. So if you stand back in terms of looking what happens to the body, that where we know that the brain can use ketone bodies really comes from a lot of the early information in terms of what happens if we end up in a famine or a starvation perspective. And when that happens over time, our livers naturally start making more ketone bodies. And as we're doing that, the brain normally and just naturally uses the ketones as its fuel instead of the glucose.
Okay, so it's just for everybody following along, ketone is a derivative of the fat that we would be eating?
Is a derivative of fat, yeah. So when we're talking about the fat, we're really talking about ketone bodies because the brain itself doesn't burn fat, but the liver can turn fat into ketone bodies and the brain can use those ketones. Probably the very first example of trying to feed a diet that would promote the production of ketone bodies was being used in children that had drug-resistant epilepsy. And in there, they were finding that if they were giving the ketones to the body as the fuel instead of glucose, that there could actually be a reduction either in seizure severity or seizure frequency. So that was kind of giving us some evidence of saying, oh gosh, not only is it a fuel the brain can use, but maybe under certain circumstances, it's actually a preferred fuel. You're now seeing that science is being drawn over into the Parkinson's and the Alzheimer's disease and those types of disorders. And from an animal model perspective, I think that it's saying that some of the data is encouraging. The real problem is that it's very difficult to get the body to make ketone bodies.
Because that's sort of the last resort as far as the last thing our body will reach for when it's totally out of sugar. That's the only time we would use them?
Yeah, well, yes. And so basically the ketone body is produced when we're in very high rates of fat breakdown. When you look at the diets that are fed to the children with epilepsy, they're very abnormal diets. They're running at about 70 to 80% fat. Then obviously trying to focus, particularly because they're kids, to make sure that they have enough protein to grow.
So are they just eating bacon and eggs all day, or how did they even do that?
Well, absolutely, and virtually sitting down to blocks of butter in order to be able to get the calories in. So we're not talking about natural diets, but given the situation, it's the right thing to do for these kids, right? But for the average person out there who's otherwise healthy, to try and force themselves into this ketone body production, I don't think is necessarily a wise thing to be doing.
What about fasting? Some people who do fasting claim that, they get real mental clarity after a few days of going on a juice fast or a water fast or something like that. From your perspective as a scientist, what's behind that?
I think the only thing that could potentially be behind that, one is if you fast long enough, you're going to start making ketone bodies, right? Because we're saying that it's associated with starvation, and fasting is basically starvation. So they may be getting something that is actually giving us an indication of the ketone bodies. And then also you're going to be getting changes in levels of endorphins and things like that. So natural hormones that the body is producing, and that itself could be contributing to the euphoria. So, sort of, is there enough anecdotal information information out there to argue that people that go on prolonged fast are sort of entering into this euphoric state, and I would have to say that there is. Can we actually identify the metabolic or biologic correlate of that euphoria? At this point, I would say no, but I think that there's a couple of logical things that you could go after in terms of trying to explain it.
Let's see. I think that's the end of my questions that I actually kind of had laid out. Is there anything that you'd like to circle back to?
Yeah, well, I think that, sort of the first circle back for me is always the fact that a huge part of our brain health is associated with our lifestyle. So while we keep hearing about, sort of genetic influences and identification of new genes, from a scientific perspective, that discovery is hugely important. But at the end of the day, our lifestyle is the bigger contributor to our brain health. And I see that as a way of helping empower people to know that there are things that they can do. There's things that they can do throughout their lifespan in terms of trying to promote their brain health and really kind of giving that power back to the individual. Clearly, I'm interested in it from a diet nutrition perspective, but we're talking about exercise, we're talking about keeping yourself cognitively stimulated, as all of those types of things. I think we really want to bring it forward in a glass half full perspective, in that there are things you can do rather than the glass half empty. If you have this gene, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, and also like a personal responsibility thing, which I think people do find sort of empowering when they realize that they can make a difference in their own.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's the main message that I also try to bring across in when I'm talking to the public.
So you specialize a lot in sort of dealing with people with advancing age and how their neurology is progressing. What are some age-specific issues? Because we haven't really talked about that much of like how the brain changes over the course of a person's lifespan. I guess some of those transitions are probably inevitable, but what can be done to sort of optimize that so people are hopefully as sharp on the way out as they were on the way in?
That's right. And I think that's a huge question in people that are interested in age-related research is how much is, sort of the inevitability of aging and how much does our lifestyle contribute to some of the declines that we experience. And I think what we're learning over time is that a huge part of what we experience as decline over our lifespan is actually under lifestyle control. So again, going back and arguing that there's a whole lot that we actually can do. There's, absolute needs in terms of infants and developing brains. But once we kind of get beyond that, we kind of tend to forget about our brain health, sort of from our 20s until our 60s.
Sometimes in our 20s, we do things to actively demote our brain health.
That's right. Exactly. And then, kind of people are all of a sudden, starting to face retirement. They may have had a parent with dementia, and they're, now all of a sudden interested in that focus in terms of saying, I don't want my retirement years to be spent in a nursing home. And really what we're arguing is that if you don't want to spend your retirement years in the nursing home, you've really got to start focusing on your lifestyle in your 20s and 30s, because all of the insults that the brain is experiencing over, sort of that whole adult lifespan is more important than what you're doing when you get the golden handshake at 65. Now, we understand that we're always born with what we call cognitive reserve, so we have more capacity than what we actually need in order to be able to perform a task. And that reserve is going to decline over time, and we're not really going to be able to experience the loss of that reserve until it's gone. And that's when, sort of you're starting to see the impact of that lack of reserve in people in their, 60s and 70s. But the reserve itself is declining, sort of with a bad lifestyle over the course of your middle adult years. So I kind of try to put it into the osteoporosis analogy, where we know that, kind of in our adolescence and early 20s is when we really have to focus on building maximal bone density so that we've got as much as possible by the time we, get into our 70s so that we don't end up with osteoporosis. But then we also need to keep exercising and keep putting weight-bearing, load-bearing exercise on those bones in order to be able to maintain that density. The brain, in some ways, is exactly the same thing. We really need to focus on making sure that we're doing everything from a lifestyle perspective to make sure that we're building that reserve, during our adolescence and earlier years. And then once we've built it, to do everything we can to retain it. You're not going to notice necessarily those differences in your 20s. And that's the unfortunate part of it, right? Is we're saying the lifestyle now in your 20s and 30s and 40s is going to make sure that you're on a beach in your 70s rather than a nursing home. But unless you can get something tangible, it's sometimes hard to get people to do that.
So, if you're worried about whether you're going to have a heart attack when you're 60, it's like I can go in as a 30-year-old and get my blood test and see, oh, my HDLs are so high, my LDLs are so high. There doesn't seem like there's necessarily an equivalent of that for brain health. Is there something that we could look at as sort of an early warning sign?
No, but that's actually some of the research that's going on in my institute at this point, is kind of what indicators can we really find that would be really early indicators that somebody's more likely to be at risk. So at this point, I think the best indicators that we have, because of this connection between heart health and brain health, is any indicator that you would be having as a risk indicator for a heart attack or stroke or anything like that. Think of that as being the same indicator in terms of telling you that you're putting yourself at dementia risk.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to go eat some avocados or something for my brain now.
Sounds good.
All righty. So that was the interview, and that was the episode. Wait a minute. No, it wasn't. We still got the ruthless listener retention gimmick. I can't believe I almost forgot. Okay, so here we go.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So the Indian company Aurobindo Pharma Limited got the U.S. FDA's nod for the production of 100 and 200 milligram tablets of modafinil, the generic form of the anti-narcolepsy stay-awake drug Provigil. Now, what does this mean? Apparently, modafinil is now a $1.2 billion market in the U.S. So, does this mean that we're going to see prices drop as this generic drug enters the market? I can only assume so. However, we're going to find out within the next week or two as I go to my highly placed sources in the modafinil sourcing industry and try to get to the bottom of this for you guys.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that is the whole episode. Thank you very much for hanging around till the end. Hopefully you liked what you heard. It's our second episode, so we're still kind of getting our feet underneath of us, but hopefully hopefully we're at least toddling by now. Please tell anybody that you think might have any interest in this podcast of its existence. If you know somebody that's super smart and is trying to get smarter and they might like it, or if you know somebody that's incredibly stupid and you wish they were smarter, then maybe tell them too. Basically, tell anybody you want to. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to anything that we mentioned here. We'll be back next week, same time, same podcast, and the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, everybody.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization.